On behalf of the Norman Williams Public Library, I welcome you to this event with Ben and Tanya Mezrich. I want to first say thank you to Woodstock Community Television for recording this. It'll be available later on their website and ours, and it's really great because they've done a lot of our events. And a special thanks to our co-host, the Yankee Bookshop, without whom we wouldn't get all of these wonderful authors necessarily. And they donate a portion of their proceeds back to the library so we can have even more events. So thank you, Yankee. Okay, so while Tanya and Ben Mezrich live most of the time in Boston, we are lucky to have them part-time in our community here in Vermont. Tanya attended Tufts University where she studied French literature, art history, and eventually dentistry. She established her own jewelry and Coley lines, and she's well known in the fashion and style as a fashion and style expert, especially in the Boston region. And Tanya and Ben have collaborated on a series of books for young readers. And in addition to writing for young readers, Ben has published 24 best-selling books over the past 20 years. I think it's probably more than 24 at this point. And he helped turn several into hit movies. Many of you know him for Bringing Down the House, which was the story of the MIT students who took Vegas for millions, or The Accidental Billionaires, which was about Facebook and the founding of Facebook. So he also writes novels, which I didn't realize until just recently. And his new book is The Mistress and the Key, and it's a sequel to The Midnight Ride. And I have to say, who knew that Ben Franklin, Paul Revere, the heist at the Gardner Museum, and a mysterious cabal of powerful alchemists were all connected? And here to tell us about them all is Ben Mezrich.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you guys so much for having us here, and thank you to the Yankee Bookshop for being a great supporter of authors and of the community. So we're going to just kind of start diving into it, and we'll kick it off with a little bit of information about your writing process. What inspired you to start writing? Can you kind of describe the 12-year-old you to us?
12-year-old me.
And, you know, how you come up with your ideas and your stories.
Okay, yeah, and thank you all for coming out. And, you know, this is such a wonderful place to do this, and we love Yankee. It's just incredible being part of this community. So, yeah, I wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid. My parents had a rule when we were little that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So I started reading as a very little kid for the wrong reasons, because I wanted to watch TV, but fell in love with it, and at the age of 12, really just wanted to be a writer. And I just wrote basically starting then, and it was about, you know, when I was 13, 14, I even was submitting books to publishers and getting rejections, and all the rejections were really nice, like, how old are you? But then I was in college and writing, just trying to figure out how you break in, because there's no like application, there's no process. My family had no history in the arts at all. My dad's a doctor. My mom went to law school and had practiced a little bit. And so when I announced to my parents I'm going to be a writer, it didn't go over great, as you can imagine. They were like, well, that's fine on the side, but what are you going to do for a living? And I was like, no, this is all I want to do. And so it basically, when I graduated from college, my dad said to me, you know, I'm not going to let you starve for a year. So I'll give you 1 year where we'll give you just enough money to live, but you have to show some level of like that you're going to be able to make a career out of this, or then you got to go to grad school or something. You got to do something else with your life. So that year I locked myself up in an apartment in Boston, and I wrote 9 novels in 1 year. I wrote 40 pages a day every day, morning to night, which I don't recommend. It's a crazy thing to attempt to do. And I would go every week to the post office, because back then there was no internet, and I would mail these manuscripts off to publishers, and a week later I would get these rejections and rejections and rejections, and I got about 190 rejection slips in that year, and I had them taped to the walls like a serial killer, and kept going, and the people at the post office knew me. I would show up and they'd be like, did you sell one? And I'm like, no, it's another rejection. They were all part of the journey. And by the end of that year, I managed to land Well, managed to land an agent by the end of that year. And then I sold my book about one and a half year later, my first book, which nobody read. It was a book called Threshold. It was a thriller. So at the time I was writing fiction because I loved Brady Snellis and Jay McInerney, and I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be this New York cool writer who hung out in bars. And that's what I was writing, and that's why I was getting all that rejection. And then eventually an editor who took pity on me was like, go read John Grisham, go read Michael Crichton, try and write a thriller. And so my first book that I sold was a medical thriller, which sold like 5 copies. And it was not a big book by any means, but it managed to get me another book, which was also a thriller. And my first 6 books were all thrillers. They were like pop sci-fi thrillers. And I got a little notoriety at the time, not because I was selling any books, because I certainly wasn't. Nobody was reading my books. But I managed to get a TV movie made out of one of them, which was really bad, called Fatal Error, which was the first premiere movie at TBS, which starred Antonio Sabato Jr. and Robert Wagner and Janine Turner from Northern Exposure. It was an awful, awful, awful TV movie. And I wrote for the X-Files a little bit. So I was having a career, but I wasn't like getting anywhere. And that's when I met the MIT Blackjack team. I was out with a friend of mine from college, and she introduced me to this group of MIT kids who had tons of money, and it was all $100 bills, just stacks of $100 bills. And I couldn't figure out why, and eventually I went over to the main character's house, and in his laundry was $250,000 in just money. And he invited me to Vegas the next day, and I started going to Vegas with the MIT Blackjack team and realized I had stumbled into a story that was better than all the fiction I'd been writing. And that became my first nonfiction book. So I never set out to be a nonfiction writer or a journalist. It just wasn't, I never had any training in it. It wasn't something I was interested in, but I'd stumbled into a real life kind of thriller. So I wrote Bringing Down the House, which then became a big book, and then that became the movie 21. So that's kind of how I got to my career.
From the 12-year-old you.
Yeah, the 12-year-old me. Yeah.
And you talked about how you went from fiction to nonfiction. Some people, like Janet Maslin, like to poke fun at you a little bit,
Yes.
and how you blend that fact of fiction.
Yes.
How do you balance like keeping the accuracy but also being able to be a vivid storyteller?
Yeah, great question. So right now, if any of you would get New York Magazine, there's a huge profile of me right now, which is, do you guys carry New York Magazine? Oh. Does anybody around here carry New York Magazine? I got to go grab a copy. I haven't actually gotten a hold of, what? Maybe one of the markets does. So they did a huge, they sent a writer who stayed with me. It was really funny because this writer was like, I want to follow you around as you live this crazy, exciting life. And I was like, well, I'm going to be in Queechee during the summer. So I was like, I don't think there's going to be a lot of parties with celebrities, but it is a nice life. You want to come. So he actually came up here to Queechee for a week and stayed here and then in Boston with us. And actually, it is a great article. I think, so what I do with nonfiction is not for everyone. There are a lot of sort of journalists of an old world journalism style who see what I do as pushing the boundaries a little bit too far. Because what I do is I do all the research. I get to know the characters very well. I get all of the thousands of pages of court documents, whatever the story is. But then when I write it like it's a movie, because my goal is the movie. I never set out to win a Pulitzer or whatever. My goal was to always have a paperback book that says now a major motion picture. Like that was my goal from the beginning. So when I sit down to write nonfiction, even though it's a true story, I turn it into something that you could see on the screen. And so some journalists like that and some journalists don't. So I remember my very first review was the New York Times, and it was like, this is a bad book. Someone should make it into a movie. And it was like kind of the perfect line for me in my career. And then Janet Maslin at the Times is like, she's basically, when I hear when she was at the Times that when my book came in, she pushed everyone aside to get it because she was like, I'm going to review the Mezrich one. And she wrote these incredible reviews, which I loved, by the way, but really taking aim at the way I write nonfiction. And so I'm very clear about it in the beginning of the books. And these are fiction, so these are, I can get away with anything in these. But in my nonfiction, I feel that I'm telling the story in a way that is a true telling of the story, but written in a fashion that is a little bit more fun. And what's interesting is in my career, when I started doing it, nobody else was doing it, and I was getting a lot attack. And now everyone does that. And I get much less attack because I think I, to some extent, created this kind of genre of narrative nonfiction. And it goes back to like Hunter S. Thompson. It goes back to sort of a type of writing that I think was popularized by that generation and the beat and all that kind of stuff. But what I did was turn it into thrillers, which has made my Hollywood career enormously strong because Hollywood immediately saw that this was a great way to take true stories and have a ready-made film out of it, as opposed to picking up Walter Isaacson's tome and trying to turn that into a movie, which they find much more difficult to do. With mine, it's actually a lot simpler process. So we can get into that whole how my Hollywood career works a little later, but I do think it's really funny that Tanya has to actually listen to me right now. Like, if we were at home, she would have already been like, all right, I already heard all this. Right now, she has to pretend at least that we're having a conversation about all this stuff. I could just talk about anything. You have to hear about it. But yeah, so that's yeah. So in the end, I think what I do is a very valid form of nonfiction. And I always tell this story, but I remember when Bringing Down the House came out, the Boston Globe had its bestseller list, and Bringing Down the House was #2. And I saw next to Bringing Down the House, there was like a little star in the corner. And I was like, why is there a star next to it? And I looked down at the bottom, and it said, next to the star, it said, may contain fictional elements. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then I looked at what was the #1 nonfiction book, and it was Jon Stewart's Fake History of America, which was a book that had no nonfiction. It was entirely fictional, right? But it's just the way they judged my nonfiction early on was that this shouldn't be nonfiction. Now it's clearly a form of nonfiction, but I think our standards have changed a little bit about what we accept as true and what's not.
Would you say you developed this type of nonfiction?
I'd love to take ownership for it. I
is
think
that
that I was.
Hunter S. Thompson or like?
Well, Hunter S. Thompson was different in that what he was doing was not thrillers necessarily, but was clearly more putting himself into the story and then writing the story in a certain way, and then going off on these weird drug tangents that, obviously didn't really happen. But I think there's an evolution of this form of writing. But I do think, not even on purpose, I did groundbreaking work in terms of turning a nonfiction story into a cinematic thriller. Because, Michael Lewis does a little bit of it, but he's certainly much more of a journalist than I am, I think. There's other writers doing what I do now, but for the most part, I do think when I started doing it, nobody else was doing it like this.
Yeah. You were breaking ground.
I like the time. Thank you. I get it.
So that's a good segue into the next topic that I wanted to touch upon, which is your books to movies.
Yes.
You've had several books that have been, turned into award-winning films. What has your experience been collaborating with these filmmakers? How does that process sort of differ from writing the book?
Yeah.
itself?
So I set out to sell a movie. So what I do, which is different than almost all writers, I would say pretty much all writers, is I don't just sit down and write a book. I write a 10 to 14 page proposal, which I first take out to Hollywood. So the first step, I hear about the story, I sit down with the main characters, I get enough to write 14 pages. I take those 14 pages and I send it all over Hollywood to all the producers and actors and directors, and at this point now it's like going right to the actors who I think would be good in it, or the screenwriters who I think would write it. And then hopefully I sell the movie or a television show. And then I go to the publishers, I sell the book, then I'm writing the book while a team is developing the movie. So there's a screenwriter attached, there might be a star attached, whatever. And I've done this since The Social Network. So for 15 books now, I've sold the movie or television show. If I don't sell the movie or television show, like it just doesn't get sold, I won't write the book. I move on to the next subject. So I don't write a book unless there's already some sort of Hollywood attachment to it. So I am, in some state, writing the books to be movies or television shows. Working with, as an author, my only real power is who I sell the project to, because once there's a studio involved, you don't have a lot of control over what's going to happen with it. So I do work very, very tightly with the screenwriters, often, with the director. When it gets to be a movie, I get to be on set and be a part of that process. And at this point, I'm producing them as well, so I'm involved in the production capacity. But, it's been an evolution in my career from back with Bringing Down the House, where Kevin Spacey called me out of the blue, which at the time was a good thing. Let's be clear, it's not the same as it would be today. He was the biggest actor in the world at the time, and he's like, I want to make a movie out of this. And I was like, great, make a movie out of it. And he ended up, it took 5 years to get that movie made. But 21 was a huge hit. And then The Social Network was a very different process, where it was almost an overnight movie. It was kind of a crazy situation how that all came down. But that was really with Sorkin and Fincher, which is this kind of like terrifying, intimidating, brilliant couple of people who made just an unbelievable film. And so every film has been different. And then Dumb Money was happened so fast as well. So what my process does is it speeds it all up enormously. Like I'm working on a new project right now, which is called Checkmate, which is a should I go into that now? I don't know. We're jumping around. That's it. If any of you follow the game of chess, there was like a huge scandal a couple of years ago where Magnus Carlsen, who was like the Mozart of chess, he's the greatest player in the history of the game, sat down with this 19-year-old kid named Hans Niemann. And Hans is an up-and-coming kid who's like the bad boy of chess. He's trashing hotel rooms. He's talking crap about everybody. He's a prodigy also, but a much younger generation prodigy. And they played in St. Louis at the World Championship of America, which is the Sinkfield Cup. And Hans won. And shockingly, was not paying attention to the game, was not, wasn't even looking, was moving pieces without thinking. And Magnus was stunned by this and went home and basically accused Hans of cheating. And it became this enormous scandal because Hans then filed a $100 million lawsuit against Magnus and chess.com, which is now where almost all chess is played, because chess.com was in the process of buying Magnus's company for $100 million and put out a giant report basically saying that Hans, although we didn't have proof he cheated in this game, was a cheater. And so it's this kind of really interlocking, crazy story about these two prodigies at different points in their career, and about this generational gap between Magnus, which is kind of old world chess, where it used to be dominated by Russians, where it's two people in a smoky room sitting over a board, and Hans, who's this kid in this internet generation, and it's all about streaming and TikTok and how you make money off of chess. And he's part of this generation that doesn't really care so much about cheating. The new generation coming up, when I talk about this story, to them the hero of the story is Hans, not Magnus. But if you talk to my dad, the hero of the story is obviously Magnus and not Hans. And so it's really this cool generational story, and then interlocking in it is this whole idea of AI. Because the reality is any 12-year-old with an iPhone can now beat any chess player. Magnus is not better than the weakest phone in your pocket, because AI has gotten to the point where chess is irrelevant. Humans are irrelevant in the game of chess, and you can just immediately analyze and beat him. And so it's telling a story about all of us. We're all going to be replaced at some point. Every field is going to be better done by a computer, and chess is kind of the canary in the coal mine. So anyways, it's a big story. It's a big book, and I sold it to Emma Stone and Nathan Fielder at A24 as a proposal. So now I'm writing the book while the studio is working on the movie, and it's kind of this back and forth process, and we'll see if we have a movie within a year, but that's the plan. So it's kind of a different way of doing books, where I see it all in partnership with the film side of it.
So I'm going to change gears a little bit because
Yes.
we are here to talk about the Mistress and the
Yeah,
King.
yeah.
And we'll get back to the movie stuff at the end as well. And I also want to leave time in case people have questions at the end. So can you just give us a brief overview? Well, actually, first off, has anyone here read The Midnight Ride? I see a couple of hands. And has anybody had a chance to dig into this? This is brand new, so I wouldn't expect that many. All right, just to get a gauge of what our audience knows. Can you, Ben, give us a brief overview of The Mistress and the Key and sort of what themes or messages that you hope that readers will take away from it?
Sure. Yeah, so these are a little bit of a departure for me, and goes back to where I started, where it's a Da Vinci Code National Treasure style thriller that takes place in Boston. It starts in modern times. A young woman who is a card counter from MIT, essentially, is at the New Encore Casino in Boston, and she finds a dead body in a hotel room. And that's where it kind of opens. And it goes from there down a very twisting rabbit hole to the Gardner Art Museum theft, which is, most of you probably know about that, which is sort of the greatest unsolved art heist in history, where a number of really famous paintings were stolen in the middle of the night by two guys dressed as cops from the Gardner Museum in Boston and have never been recovered. But what's interesting about that story is that there's a lot more to that story than people know. And so the way I got into this story was twofold. The reason I wrote this book starts in the pandemic, and this is I'm talking about The Midnight Ride. where I got a call from the Boston Globe, and it was in the worst part of the pandemic, when everyone was kind of locked up and we were all terrified. And in the beginning, and they were like, the newspaper is just full of bad news all the time. We want to do something more fun for our readers. Would you be interested in doing like a serialized something, like Dickens used to do, where you write one thing each day for 20 days? And I was like, I'll do it, but only if I can write like a thriller. And they were like, if you can do that, then do it. So I wrote The Midnight Ride originally in 20 days, writing a chapter a day of this very intricate thriller, handing it in by the afternoon, and then they would work at night to typeset it and get the artwork and everything like that, and it would come out in the newspaper the next morning. And what was really cool is by the end of the 2 weeks, we had 250,000 daily readers. It became this kind of big thing in Boston, and it was really, really cool. So I wrote this book pretty fast in this kind of crazy state. But where the story originated was about 10 to 12 years ago, might have been longer ago, where I was at home and I got a phone call in the middle of the night from a guy, and people would call me with stories all the time because I'd become known as this sort of writer. And he claimed that he was one of the people who robbed the Gardner Art Museum, that he had just gotten out of prison for a very similar crime, that he was at a payphone, and he wanted to meet with me, and he could prove it. And I was like, this is really interesting. And he told me all of this intricate detail about the theft. And then he said, I want to meet you. And he gave me an address in South Boston. And he said, you have to come at 3 in the morning. And I'm going to break my parole to meet with you, because he wasn't allowed to leave California, which is where he was, and come, Wednesday night at 3 a.m. And I was like, well, I don't know if I want to do that, right? I don't know anything about this person other than that he's a criminal. And so I ended up chickening out. I didn't go. Never heard from him again. To this day, I don't know whether I could have solved the Gardner art theft or not. I have no way of knowing. And so that's always been in the back of my head. So in the opening of Midnight Ride, I show the theft from what he told me. So that may actually be how the theft went down. I have no way of knowing whether this guy was full of it or not. So really, this guy wrote the first chapter in Midnight Ride, not me. But what was intriguing in what he had told me, and this has always bothered a lot of people about the Gardner theft, is that apart from these incredibly valuable paintings that were stolen, 2 other items were taken that were not particularly valuable, one of which was really hard to steal. You had to climb up a wall, you had to unscrew something, you had to get this out of this place, and there was no point to it because it wasn't worth very much. It couldn't be resold. It wasn't art. And so that had always bothered the investigators as well, and this guy gave me the reason for that, which was really cool. So that's how that story kind of came about and became the Midnight Ride. So the Mistress and the Key follows from where the Midnight Ride ends. And the Midnight Ride is, these 2 characters, the woman I described who's next card counter, and this ex-con, this kind of Boston-y ex-con, who are kind of unraveling why this theft happened, and it leads to Paul Revere. There's a really intriguing connection between Paul Revere and the Gardner theft, and I've always been fascinated by Revolutionary Era history. So these are chock full of Revolutionary Era history, and I actually, I sell the most copies of this book at the Paul Revere House in Boston, because they were my main sources. So I ended up becoming friends with a bunch of professors there, and they helped guide. So all of this is true stuff, and it's really interesting. The Paul Revere story is really, really cool, because what most people don't know about revolutionary history is that it's not what we were taught in like 7th or 8th grade. A lot of these characters were troublemakers. They were not the people that you think they were. Paul Revere himself was essentially a thug and a terrorist to some extent, who the other ones did not like. It's kind of a cool, intriguing sort of way of looking at history. And so Mistress and the Key starts kind of in Boston, but then ends up in Philadelphia, and then Ben Franklin comes into this story in a pretty interesting way, and he's obviously a fascinating character from the time period. And this story is very much more international. We go all around the world to Paris and London and New York. And I don't want to give a lot away because these stories are kind of more fun if you're unveiling things as you go through them. So if someone has specific questions, I could get into it. But yeah, I think that's kind of the overview. So they're different than what I normally write, but I think it's a fun kind of way of looking at history, and it's written as a thriller. Yeah.
Did you know when you were writing The Midnight Ride that there would be a sequel?
Yeah, my plan was always multiple books. It was a question of whether an audience would be there for them. But yes, so I ended up selling this to Spielberg to be developed into a movie. So that kind of gave life to the series somewhat, and that's how I got the second book. And we'll see where we go from here.
Do you think that like your narrative style changed from one book to the next, or even from your Globe version of the
Yeah.
mechanic?
So basically, what was in the Globe was only a quarter probably the size of this, because it was 20 chapters. And so to turn it into a book, I had to extend it and make it a little bit heavier. And then when I wrote this one, it was kind of this, it's a really fun book in my opinion, because I just let it go. I went crazy. So the reviews have been phenomenal on it. It's probably my best reviewed book, which is kind of funny. But it definitely goes in some really wild directions.
Yeah, you got a positive Kirkus review.
I did, yes. A couple of good reviews.
Really awesome reviews. Yeah. And do you think, like, how did the main characters evolve from this story to that story? And, like, were there any changes in their motivations?
I mean, I think, different bad guy. I kind of developed a really neat bad guy in the story, which was really, really fun. And I think the main characters are sort of on a pretty intense quest. So, yeah, I think they develop as we go through. Yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit about Paul Revere and dentistry.
Yes, Paul Revere was a dentist. Some of you might remember that from seventh grade. He was a dentist. He was a dentist. He was a silver maker. He was a businessman. He was a rebel. And he organized the first spy organization, which were called the Mechanics at the time, which were spying for pre-revolution. And then dentistry was his main kind of career. He did not make George Washington's false teeth, although that was always something people would talk about, but that's not what happened. But he also invented forensic dentistry. The idea of identifying bodies from their dental work came from him. And then he became obsessed with bells, and he began to make bells, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bells. And there's actually one at the Woodstock Inn, a Revere bell. I don't know if you guys noticed that. Yeah, what? At the Woodstock Inn? I believe that. Yeah, there's a whole bunch. I've only seen that one. Yeah, isn't that cool? And then he did copper work. He did the copper on top of the dome in the State House in Boston, and he actually did the copper on the Constitution, the USS Constitution ship, to make it, bulletproof essentially, although it didn't really work. But he was the first kind of copper maker. He's kind of a wild character in that the horse ride thing was the smallest part of his life. But that's the only thing we remember, and that story didn't even take place as we remember it. Wasn't really on horseback, and there were multiple riders. It wasn't just him, and there was a lot of different twists and turns to that story as well. But yes, Paul Revere is a fascinating character that people don't really know a lot about, and he was not well liked among the revolutionaries because he was somewhat terroristic. He wanted to push the boundaries beyond where a lot of them wanted to push it. And Ben Franklin specifically did not love Paul Revere. Ben Franklin was friendly with the Europeans and spent most of his life in Europe and was not as rebellious in the beginning of his life as Paul Revere wanted everyone to be.
And were there any sort of surprising elements in Ben Franklin's history that you discovered?
I mean, there's a lot about Ben Franklin that people know and people don't know, but I mean, he had a lot of affairs and a lot of mistresses, and obviously the mistress in this story is one of them, which was the most intriguing of his mistresses, because it lasted much of his life, later part of his life, but was always platonic, and no one could figure out what was the purpose of it. And so it's an intriguing part of the story. I mean, he was the most famous man alive at his time period. And for instance, in France, he was revered as a huge hero because of his invention of the lightning rod. Because Paris used to have fires all the time because lightning would strike, because everything was wood. And Ben Franklin invented the lightning rod, which saved thousands of people. And he became super famous because of that. And these are things that I never learned as a kid. I didn't know he invented the lightning rod. I mean, I knew he invented a couple things, but his inventions were kind of staggering, all of them. And then in this book, one of his inventions that I really find fascinating is the harmonica. Not the harmonica, the harmonica. I don't know if any of you know what that is, but it is basically a piano, but the way it works is there's glass bowls, and you spin them with foot pedals, and then you run your hands over them or felt over them, and you know how you can play a glass bowl with your finger, and you play it like that. And so it's moving bowls. And for a time period, it was becoming incredibly popular to the point where people thought it was going to overtake pianos. And they would do these grand concerts on harmonica, and Mozart even wrote music for the harmonica Then a strange thing happened. People started getting sick at these concerts. Um, and nobody knew why. And to this day, nobody knows why. It was either some form of hysteria or there was some sort of sound issue that made people feel queasy. And that's why the harmonica went away. It was because people were getting ill at these concerts, and that story spread throughout Europe, and then people didn't want to go to those concerts. So it's not even clear it's true, but it's a really cool, for me as a writer, I'm like, well, that's neat. You know, why are people getting sick from these things? There still are harmonicas in some places. I don't know if any of you have ever seen one. I've seen them in a couple of museums, and they even every now and then bring them out for concerts. And I really want to go to one and see if I feel sick. but it's, now I will, because I'm a hypochondriac, and knowing that I'm supposed to feel sick, I will feel sick. But it is a really cool instrument and invention that I think, you know, hopefully people will read the book and it'll get some notoriety and come back.
And you know, this adventure takes place in so many of the cool cities
That you want to go, that
I
Tanya
wanna
wants to go to.
Thank
That's
you.
how I write, is I pick
Thank
the
you for
cities
that.
that we can get away with going as I research it.
So how did you decide on those cities? And like, do those cities, is it from your own personal experience visiting
Some
those
of them
cities?
are. I mean, I've traveled a lot, but I knew that, you know, to tell a story that involves Ben Franklin, you had to use Paris, and I wanted to use London, part of it, and then New York. I don't want to give away too much, but there's reasons for those cities being the specific reasons. Philadelphia, obviously, for Franklin, and Boston. So this one takes place almost entirely in Boston, and then we kind of shift from city to city as we go into that one. But yeah, I mean, I'm usually looking for stories that take place in places I want to go. And I was lucky that the chess story actually ended up ending in Paris, because the two of them had a rematch in Paris this fall. First time they'd met since the cheating incident. And it was, Tanya was there as
keep
well. It
doing
was,
projects that take place in Paris.
yeah, I know, you like that. But it was incredibly tense because they hate each other. It was like this kind of crazy moment that we got to be there as part of, which was really cool. Yeah.
So should we open it
Yeah,
up
let's go to questions. I think we're at that point.
Okay. I'm just going to open it up for questions. If people have any questions about the writing process, about either of these books,
Or any of my
his
books. I've written a
nonfiction
lot of
books.
nonfiction. Yeah, sure. So I am a very rigid writer in terms of my writing, which is interesting because in my life I'm the least sort of, I'm the messiest person in the world. But when I write, I have a proposal, which is like 15 pages long, 14 pages long. Then I have an outline, which can be 100 pages long. My outline is the most intense part of my writing. And my outline is so specific that I know page numbers in every chapter. I know everything that happens in every chapter. And I have my research in like a big stack. When I'm actually writing, I'm just writing. So my writing can be just following. I've already got the skeleton. I already know what the thing looks like. So basically, yes, once I start the writing process, like I'm writing this book right now, I'm already in the writing process. It's just a matter of, and I write by pages and not by time. So it's not like I'm going to write 8 hours today. It's going to be, I'm going to write 6 pages today. And if you do that, I could be done in an hour, or I could be done in 8 hours. My days are either short or long, depending on how long. And I think by writing by page, it's much better for you as a writer. Because if I say I'm going to write 8 hours today, I might get nothing done. I might just sit there and stare at the computer. I mean, writing is horribly painful. It's an awful thing to do. But if you say I'm going to write 6 pages today, well, it incentivizes you to work faster and more efficiently and better. I write in dark usually. I usually have music going. I usually have the window blinds down. I look like a rat in a hole. It's a crazy process. I used to tie a tie around my head like a bandana, like the Dumb Money character. I used to have all these I used to play games of backgammon with myself until I started, I get into the zone. I found different ways to get into that writing zone, but once I start going, and I will say, my output has decreased from the 40 pages a day, which I'm no longer capable of, I don't think. Right now, it's 6 to 10 pages a day, depending on how I'm feeling that day, which is still a great clip. You can get a lot done pretty quickly. But I did write Bringing Down the House in 8 weeks, and I wrote the Social Network book in 11 weeks. And Dumb Money I wrote in 2 months. Yeah, it's 8 weeks. So I can write a book very quickly. No, that's the writing part. The outline usually takes a few weeks of its own, 1 to 2, not long, like 1 to 2 weeks. Yeah, it's all of the kind of taking all of the research into, and then the research phase is dependent on, how easy it is to get people to talk to you. So when I'm doing nonfiction, like often I'm doing stories where they don't want to talk to me, Like trying to nail down Elon Musk was a treat in itself, as you can imagine. It can be very difficult, the research phase, or it can be easy depending on who you're working with, and you spend a lot of time researching it. So the whole book process takes more like, well, it depends on the book. But this book will be a 6-month process all around. Some of my books have been 2 to 3 months. Some of the books have been, I've never taken more than 6 months on a book, ever in my career. Well, I don't know if it's gifted or crazy. I'm just very OCD-ish. Well, Tanya can tell you all of my neuroses, but I'm very, when I'm writing, it's a very intense, insane way of living, which has changed as I've had kids. Now we have little kids or school-age kids now, so I work my writing around the kids' lives. But it's still kind of just in those periods, it can be pretty intense and wild. And I don't know. I've always been able to write quickly. There's never been that block in between a thought and a writing for me. It's always just, if I think it, I can write it. And I can see the scenes. Like, that's the other thing that I think is what I bring to the table, is that it is playing like a movie in my head. Like, even when I'm interviewing a source, I'm seeing that movie of what he's telling me. And so when I get home, I can just write what I just saw. And often I'm making stuff up, I'm filling in the blanks because I don't really know what color his car was, and I don't really know what he saw out the window, but I want to describe those things because you'll see those things in the movie, and so I just do. And then often I'll go back and go, hey, by the way, what color was your car? I ask the strangest questions to my sources, and I'm like, you remember what shoes you were wearing? And they'll be like, why do I care what shoes I was wearing? I'm just curious. But I'm able to fill in the blanks with my imagination. So yeah, that's the process. Thank you. Sure. Of which one? Well, the Midnight Ride, I don't know. We're in the process of figuring that out right now. I wrote a draft of the screenplay, but whether or not that'll be the draft that goes anywhere or we keep going. I don't normally write the screenplays for my own things, but the idea of giving something to Spielberg was too cool for me to pass up, and I wanted him to read my stuff. But the reality is that probably slows it down. So we'll see when these get going. But I do have a bunch of projects, which is Breaking Twitter, the Elon Musk Netflix. It's going to be a huge show on Netflix, if they still have the balls to do it. Now that Elon is running the country, it'll be interesting. We will see if they were going to make a big announcement like next week, whether they still have the guts to make the announcement they were going to make or not, because it's going to be a big show, and it's the first show or movie about Elon. And if you read Breaking Twitter, it's a pretty critical take. His spiral down, and now it turns out him buying Twitter probably led to where we are today. So I do think that story is incredibly significant now. And when I wrote it, it was the first 6 weeks at Twitter, him walking through the door carrying a kitchen sink, and how not only did he break Twitter, but Twitter broke him. And he went from being this revered Da Vinci of our time to being this person that more than half the country hates and is pretty, and disturbing. And now he's running the country. So that story is awesome. I hope Netflix is willing to keep going forwards, and I think they will. But, people are nervous about what's going to happen in January. So I will find out soon whether Netflix has the guts to keep going. Oh, gosh. Sometimes I'm working on more than one book at a time, too. And it's really not a good thing. I don't know. How do I keep it organized?
Yeah, it's your outline.
And I do. Tanya helps me a lot. So we'll sit down a lot. This week a lot, too. Is I'll be like trying to figure out this chapter. How do I do this chapter? And we'll talk it through. The hard part is definitely, as I get older, it is harder to keep all the interlocking characters and scenes in my head, which is I used to be able to do very easily. And now it's like, as you know, the memories is not what it used to be. And I'm like, wait, what did this character do? And what did this character say? But a lot of it is really just like, if it's the story I love the stories that I'm writing, and I get so excited and interested in them that there's this burst of energy that comes with trying to tell that story in a way. So that it keeps me into it. But yes, it can be confusing and hard to remember what. I wake up now, I hardly sleep now. I wake up at 2 a.m. and I write, I go over to my phone and on the notes pad, because something just came to me, and I write a page. And then I go back to 2 hours later, I'm writing another page. So while I'm writing a book, it's 24 hours a day. Like right now, it's going on in my head. And it's really intriguing because when I was talking to Magnus Carlsen about chess, so he can't hold a normal conversation a lot of the time because chess games are going on in his head. It's just like that show on Netflix, the Queen's Gambit. He was telling me like he's playing chess all the time. And if he's preparing for a battle with someone in particular, he's playing their chess games. Like the ones they played over the last decade, he's replaying their game in his head. And I think to some extent I do that. So almost all the time I'm going through the story while I'm going about my life. And then I'm like, oh crap, that's good, and I go and write it down. So yeah. Not only did Magnus destroy Hans, but destroyed him like over and over again. And then in the interview was like, he's gotten better, but as you can see, 2 years ago, he would not have been on my level. And so this kid should not even been at the table with Magnus, even if he did. And by the way, Hans is now 15 in the world. So it's not like he's gone down in chess. He's still going up in chess, and he very well could be in the top 10 within the next couple months, and maybe one day be able to challenge Magnus. Magnus is still obviously #1, but at that match, it was very clear that there was no way Hans, well, that's not fair to say. Hans could have won that game without cheating. And I'm not necessarily going to say whether or not he cheated or not, but he's definitely not on Magnus's level in chess. Like if he won, it was a huge aberration. In just the skill level is so dramatically different. Magnus is something else. I mean, his rating is the highest that anyone's ever been. He had won, leading into the match with Hans, had won 52 straight classical games over a period of 2.5 years. So he had not lost a single classical game in 2 years, which is staggering because he's only playing grandmasters. You know, he's never played someone who's worse than him. He can do the blindfolded simultaneous chess with 10 grandmasters, which is unbelievable to watch. He can't see and he can play all 10 people at the same time, which there are other people who can do that as well, but it's just a staggering level of ability in chess that it fascinates me. But he destroyed Hans. And Hans, you know, we spent a lot of time with Hans, and he's very likable, but he's on the border of there's something wrong because he's very paranoid. He thinks people are tapping his phone. He thinks he's on the border of something, some sort of serious issue probably. But it comes with that, I think, to some extent. All of these people are a little bit out there, all these players. Anyways, that book is going to be a really cool book because I get very deep into both characters because I got some time with them both. Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been attracted to sort of the geek turned rock star character, and the brilliant Zuckerbergian type who's like obviously super smart, but in that gray area where the morals aren't always there necessarily, or the way they see the world isn't necessarily how the rest of us see the world. So that sort of character fascinates me. I've never been into sort of criminals. Like true crime is huge right now. Like all my Hollywood go are like, can you do a true crime book? And I'm like, I don't really write true crime. I'm not interested in people who are just breaking the law because they're breaking the law. I'm interested in people who are so smart that they don't think the law applies to them. That intrigues me more. So yes, I am fascinated by brilliant kind of genius prodigies, like people who are just, I don't know. It's a weird sort of dynamic to me, how someone is just, their brains are just so different and they think about the world in such a different way. And it's not always a good thing. It's often a horrible thing that they think of the world that way because they become very powerful or very wealthy and they're sure they're right. They're sure they're right because no one is as smart as them. I mean, look at Elon Musk, who really and truly believes the whole world is a simulation and that he's the only real person in it and that he's winning the game. And everything he does seems to prove again and again to himself. And it's terrifying and exciting for him, but it can be horrible for the rest of the world. I think there's something incredibly fascinating about that. So yeah, I am attracted to those characters. Even when in a smaller scale story, I think even like the MIT blackjack kids, it's like they're super smart guys who kind of broke the system in an interesting way. That really is the kind of thing I like to write about, you know, people who beat the system. And it's not because I see myself, I mean, I want to live vicariously through these characters. But like when I played with the MIT blackjack team, I was horrible at it. I would just be a guerrilla player where they would signal me what to bet because I wasn't good enough to do the actual thing. And I like to kind of travel with my characters, hang out with them as much as I can, living through them. But I don't feel like I could be any of them. I'm sure it goes back to when I was a tiny little kid in high school who, you know, was not good at sports and was not super cool and didn't meet people who looked like Tanya. And so I always kind of fantasized about being that rock star. And to me, looking at those New York writers that I worship, like Jay McInerney, I was like, oh, that's how I could be a rock star. I could be Jay McInerney, or I could be whatever, John Grisham or Michael Crichton or Hunter S. Thompson. I want to be that. And so I did kind of find a way to sort of, in small doses, become the rock star I always wanted to be. But I think all the characters I write about, and you know, if you read the New York Magazine article, I think one of the things Simon did get a little bit right is that when you're seeing Mark Zuckerberg in The Social Network, you are seeing a little of me. I mean, you're seeing, you know, to some extent me, and all of my characters, I'm playing it out in some ways how I see I would be if I were them, thinking the way they think. I think it's important to remember that no one sees themselves as the villain. Nobody thinks that they're the bad guy in the movie of their life. I mean, very few people. Most people think they are the hero of their story, and the rest of the world just doesn't see it. And I think that's an interesting way to look at people who are larger than life, who are doing these incredible things. Zuckerberg clearly thinks he's saving the world. And Elon clearly thinks he's saving the world. And I don't know if Trump thinks that, but I think most of these people who are not sociopathic do feel like they're the hero in their story. So for me, it's easy to get into the head of these characters because I feel like if I was there and I had that ability and I was doing all that, how would I kind of structure my world? So yeah, but I am attracted to those stories. Those are the ones I'm always looking for. Wow, it's a great question. So first of all, yes, I am living the dream that I had as a kid. I always wanted to be a writer. The writing industry has changed dramatically since when I started. And so it's always a massive challenge to stay relevant and to stay successful in an industry that is not the same year after year. So it's not like when I started out in the 90s, it was all big thriller books. You could sell millions of copies of books. If a movie got made, great, and then you'd sell even more books. Today, you don't sell any books, unless you're a celebrity or a political book or one of those. I mean, you could say there's a few people who sell books, but the vast majority of people sell a lot of books. However, Hollywood is consuming so much because of what we stream and everything that there's an enormous market for stories. So you can tell your story via television or movies or Netflix, really, more and more just Netflix. And so I've had to shift my career, happily so, and luckily so, to being much more Hollywood-centric than it is book-centric. So who I am as a writer has certainly evolved over the years, and it's a continuous challenge to find stories that I think, I can't just write a story. So you say I could do whatever I want. Well, I really couldn't. I couldn't just submit a story tomorrow because it's a great story about these two people who fell in love, right? Nobody wants that from me, and honestly, you can't sell that story. I need Jurassic Park. I need something big every time out of the gate. I need Facebook or you know, Dumb Money, GameStop. Like, I need a big news story to tag it onto. I've got to see something that can sell in 27 countries. That's something that Hollywood would make that you know, Tom Holland wants to star in, right? So what I write is very much not under my control to some extent. But then I find the story and I can take it and make it my own. Like how I did the chess story. Honestly, this is what happened. I was sitting at home and it's like, I need another book. And I didn't have anything happening. So I just Googled scams. And nothing really came up. And I was like, oh, there's no good scams. And I Googled cheating. And I was like, wait, there's this chess story. And I was like, did anybody do that? And I looked around and I was like, there's not been a big movie or a book or a television show. And I was like, well, can I reach these guys? And I went on Instagram and found Hans and just DM'd him. And suddenly I'm talking to Hans and I'm like, I could write this story. And that's kind of how it evolved. So it's not like I could just write whatever I want. I need to find a story that I can hook into that suddenly I'm the guy writing that story. But in terms of life, yeah, I mean, I do think that I've achieved what I wanted to do. I wanted to write. I never wanted to write one book. And now this will be my 28th book is coming out next. So I've always wanted to do a book every year. So that I have achieved. I always wanted a #1 movie. And, you know, Social Network was a huge, huge movie, which is really cool and cultural. The hard part of having something like a Social Network happens is you can't expect it again. You want it again, obviously, but you can't revolve your whole life around re-achieving what you've already achieved. That's a very hard, you know, that's a heavy weight to carry. It's like, can I do that again? But for me, I want a big television show. I want, you know, a big movie, a big book every time. So, you know, and I don't always hit home runs. You hit a lot of singles to get to those home runs. But yeah, I'm on the track where I want to be. I'm thankful that with the way the industry has changed, that somehow I've stuck around. Like most writers write a book and it's great, and then 2 years later, that's it. It's very hard to stay with the shifting industry. But right now, it's very great for me. My last 2 years have been the biggest of my career in terms of Hollywood, because of just what's happening in Hollywood. But it's also a horrible time in Hollywood. If you talk to anybody in the industry, it's miserable because there's really only one major buyer now, which is Netflix. The strikes were really bad, and it has not recovered from COVID and the strikes. So almost nothing is getting made in LA right now, for instance. Boston is a bigger film market than LA right now. And there's a huge backlog. And Netflix realized that people will watch Suits, a show from the 90s. They don't need to buy the next big movie because they can just put content on from the 90s. So it's an interesting time in Hollywood. But for what I do, it's actually been a great time. So, I don't know. But I am it's always a challenge finding the next great story. The writing is not the challenge. The challenge to me is finding a story that I think hits all the cylinders I look for, getting the right kind of movie situation, and that's really it. The book side of it, I would love to be a bigger side of it. It was much bigger for me, a decade ago, but I just think people's tastes have changed. I think airports not having books in them has been very damaging to someone who writes like I write. You used to get on an airplane, everyone's holding a paperback book. Nobody reads anymore. Everyone's reading whatever, on their phone. Books are hard. Books are a hard thing to sell unless you're a celebrity or writing something political right now. But hopefully that'll shift again. We'll see. I don't know. What are you seeing? Is it going to shift? I mean, what? Yeah. Yeah. And what's great, it has been great to see stores like independent stores doing well, because that's a really phenomenal, that's the best part of the industry is what you guys do. And there was a time period when we thought that was going to be gone. Like it looked like the Barnes and Nobles and the Borders, that's what we wanted and that was going to take over. But it turns out that's not what we wanted at all. We wanted to walk into a bookstore and meet someone who knows about books and sells us something that we want to read. And that was going away. And Barnes and Nobles is the one that's going to go down the hill, it looks like. And although they don't even sell books anymore. You walk into Barnes and Nobles, the first half of it is toys and then it gets the books. Yeah. But in any event, I think it's wonderful that independent bookstores are not just surviving, but thriving, I think, to some extent, right, in this time period. But for authors, it's gotten very, very hard. I think it's a very hard time for people who just write books. And when I talk to high schools and I talk to kids a lot who want to be writers, and I'm like, you should absolutely do that, but you should also understand the market and know that if you want to make a living as an author, there has to be a bigger vision. It can't just be I'm going to write a book for a living, because it's very hard to do that now. It's just incredibly hard. But you could still do it, but most likely you need some sort of a way to turn it into a television show or a movie or a podcast or a blog. There's a million things you can do with it, but think of the story as a platform to something much, much bigger. Yeah. Anybody else? We're good?
So thank you guys, and please, Yankee Bookshop has Ben's books. He's happy to sign things.
Sure.
They make great holiday gifts. And thank you guys all for coming, and thank you to the library for hosting us.
Thank you
We
so much. It
really,
was so
really
much fun.
appreciate it.